Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming to this session. We're going to close out the day together talking about open data. My name is Jed Sonwall. I work at AWS. I run the Open Data program at AWS, and it's a program that exists to help our public sector customers who have usually really large volumes of data, help them understand how they can take advantage of the cloud to make that available to people. And today we're joined by Zachary Whitman, who's the Chief Data Officer of the US Census Bureau, and Caitlin Devine, who's a product owner of beta.usaspending.gov at the US Treasury. Is that the right way to say it? So, and so they're going to talk about some really novel and really interesting ways that they've worked on this year to open up some of their data. Before we get going, I always like to talk about why AWS cares about open data, why we even have an open data program. So open data is data that can be used by anyone for any purpose. And obviously a lot of government organizations, also a lot of nonprofits and research institutions, they produce data that's intended to be used by organizations outside of themselves, so external organizations, external stakeholders. And increasingly as data volumes in the world grow, as our capacity to produce data increases, we're producing really large data sets that are really hard to move around, right? It's not fun to download a terabyte of data, but it's very easy to produce a terabyte of data these days. And so the cloud makes it possible for people to work with data in the cloud without having to download and store their own copies. And this is incredibly efficient. And of course, the value is for a research organization or a scientific federal agency, if they have data that they want people to use and they actually want to put that data to work, making it available in the cloud makes it available to AWS users, of which there are a lot. We have a large community of users, and that's always growing. So sharing data on AWS is a great way to put data to work. There's a book called DataDriven that's free. You can get on the Kindle, I know, and I think there are other ways to read it for free, but it's by DJ Patil and Hilary Mason. DJ Patil, you may recognize his name. He was the chief data scientist of the United States in the previous administration. And then Hilary Mason is a data scientist. And they wrote this book together. It's a really good, quick read to sort of understand how to create an organization that is fueled by and informed by data. And one point they make is, they actually wrote this down in the book, which is that a lot of data scientists spend about 80% of their time just preparing data for analysis. And whenever I share this figure, I always see a lot of nodding heads, and a lot of cases, that might even be a conservative estimate. Working with data is really cumbersome a lot of times because just acquiring it and getting ready to work with it can be a huge pain. And we actually have a term for this kind of work to prepare data for analysis, because it happens all the time in IT and software development and building and deploying applications. We call this undifferentiated heavy lifting. It really rolls off the tongue. So undifferentiated heavy lifting is the work that we look at, that we see our customers that are doing, that is keeping them from doing what actually differentiates them, what their mission actually is. And we've found many, many times that just acquiring and preparing data for analysis is one of these things that is keeping people from asking questions that they want to ask or doing research they want to do. And so that's why we have an open data program and focus on open data and share applications for sharing data in the cloud, because we know it can save people a lot of time. And this is sort of what I mentioned before, which is that when data is shared in the cloud, it doesn't matter what the volume of data is. Anybody can access it and work with it without having to download their own copies. And this is one of the things that excites me most about our work, which is that just a few years ago, if you wanted to work with or analyze, let's say again, a terabyte or 10 terabytes of data, you needed to have a terabyte of your own storage or 10 terabytes of your own storage. And you also had the time, you needed to take the time to download or acquire all of that data, and that takes a really long time. And so the cloud really democratizes access to data and democratizes access to data to be analyzed, which is really remarkable. Now, of course, sharing data is just the beginning. It has to be documented. You have to provide customer service and support and train people on how to use it. And one of the things that I'm really excited to talk about today with Caitlin and Zachary is that what Treasury and Census have done have been extremely thoughtful about how their data could be shared in the cloud and looking at really novel ways of doing this so that their customers, the people who rely on their data, can do things that just wouldn't have been possible before. And so I'm going to hand the stage over to them. We're going to start with Caitlin to talk about the Data Act and their implementation of that, and then we'll go to Zach. Thank you.
Great. Let's see if I can put this up here. Not walk too far away. Summit. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Caitlin Devine. I'm the product owner for beta.usaspending.gov, and I'm on detail at the Treasury from ATNF, which is a consultancy inside the General Services Administration. So the Data Act, our charge with this law, this was passed in 2014, and essentially charges Treasury and OMB with consolidating all of the federal spending data in the government. So this has typically been kind of fractured into different communities. You kind of have your procurement folks over here, your grants folks over here, and then your CFOs and financial personnel at agencies are kind of the middle. And there's some overlap between these communities, but not a lot. And the data doesn't integrate very well together. So we were charged with creating a uniform data standard that all of this data could be reported under. So 2016, that's about $3.8 trillion. And I get very excited about this because, where we spend money as a country is our fundamental expression of our priorities as a country. So everyone deserves to know where that went and what it means, regardless of what anybody from any party says. So this was a pretty big lift. This kind of, I would say, data normalization and standardization effort across this many federal agencies, I think is pretty rare. And this is just kind of a quick graphic that shows it's really our iteration cycle. So you can kind of imagine this flow being repeated on a continuous basis. We started with an initial version of the data standard and working with all of our agency users to determine, what's going to produce the most accurate, reliable data, what is achievable. And then we had a prototype, a very early prototype of what we call the Data Act Broker, which is pulling all of this data in, ingesting it, validating it, normalizing it, and putting it into a common format. And then we iterated in that cycle for a really long time to really get to something that matches all this data up in a way that is consumable by anybody who's working with data. There's a pretty hefty oversight component to this bill. So the bill required all inspectors general at each agency to evaluate them on their data quality and their reporting. So there's also kind of this agency certification step to ensure that the quality of the data. And then it gets transferred to our data store and our public API and website, and of course onto Amazon Public Datasets. So the nature of this data is complex. There's an existing site out there called usaspending.gov, which it has essentially the lowest level of this graphic. So it has grants and contracts, and that's kind of it. But that doesn't really represent the bulk of our spending. So we have this pretty complicated hierarchical data, starting with overall spending, which, as I told you, around like 3.8 trillion, and then broken out into some basic categories that you probably think of when you think about government spending, like healthcare, defense, social security, these kinds of broad topics. And that's what Congress uses when they appropriate money. Then we get down to the next level, which is each individual treasury account that Congress puts money into falls into one of those categories. And so that's all new data we're getting. So we have every expenditure account for the federal government, which is thousands. And then we have a couple of categorizations, just different facets of the data to help track what we're spending money on exactly. So program activity kind of tracks initiatives or programs that Congress has appropriated money to. And object class is kind of tracking what kind of spending it is. So is it on contracts, or is it on employee salaries or travel or something like that? And then we get down to what's public today, or what has been public in the past, which is the award level, just the grants and contracts. So I'm on detail at the Treasury. They've been amazing partners, very forward-thinking, I would say, for a federal agency. As I said before, we've had these kind of tight iterative development cycles, building in 2-week sprints, releasing every 2 weeks, so that we're continuously getting feedback from our users. In the first kind of phase of Data Act implementation, the users are federal agencies and all the personnel who work there and are working on submitting data under the Data Act. Everything that we've built is open source on GitHub, and we built an open source from the very beginning. So my colleague at ATNF, actually Eric Mill, has a great post on the ATNF blog about working in the open from the beginning, and I highly recommend it because you don't have to go back and kind of scrub your code for stuff after the fact. And actually, since this is a a law about transparency, there's no better project, I think, to do it for. And it actually helps us a lot with federal agencies. They get to see exactly what's happening. So a lot of them have used the code, have repurposed it to build their own kind of internal data brokers. And they can see exactly what validations we're doing on their data and any kind of normalization we're doing. So, it's not just kind of going into a black box at Treasury and then seeing missing, something else happens to it. They've also been following a user-centered design process from the very beginning. So starting with our agency users, which I think was new for a lot of them. When you're building a product internal to the federal government, a lot of them aren't user-driven and a lot of them are very difficult to use. If you have complaints about federal websites that are public-facing, you should see the stuff that's internal-facing sometimes. And then, of course, our public users. So anybody who would need to make use of this data in the public sphere. And so we had, I think, about 10 overall user personas that we created for the Data Act in general. But really, what today kind of focuses on is these 3. So in the course of our user research, we identified we have this really big group of data repurposers. So these are people who have a need to get the entire database on a regular and consistent basis. There's a lot of business intelligence firms that build products on top of this data and need to run analysis across the entire data set. Gavini is an example of those. There's a whole bunch more. There's certain outlets that we publish this data to their particular consumer. We have the oversight groups. So actually, we're undergoing a GAO audit. So Data Act has been under GAO audit since the beginning of the Act. It's part of what the bill calls for. But they're using our snapshot, actually, to audit us. So they're definitely using it. The IGs at the different agencies and external nonprofit watchdogs. So before I came to H&F, I worked at the Sunlight Foundation, which is kind of an open government advocacy organization. And I had to use the old USA spending data and write a bunch of janky ETL scripts for it. So this is very, very close to my heart to be able to make this a little bit easier. And then we have data-driven journalism outlets who kind of employ their own data analysis teams that are essentially searching for stories and data. So they want to be able to get the entire data set and work with it. So what you have to do on the current usaspending.gov is you have to download a ton of CSVs, one for each fiscal year, each spending type, and each agency. And there's 17 fiscal years, so it ends up being a lot. You can't really automate there's no API to automate the downloading of those and the generation of them. Then you gotta load in the entire database, and you're kind of guessing at what the database schema should look like. And then you're adding a whole bunch of weird special cases because things are null when you don't expect them to be null, or the data types are mixed, or whatever. And then it breaks, of course, and you have to go fix it. And then you're dealing with a large set of data, so if you're trying to update this for your business on a nightly basis or a high-frequency basis, you just kind of have to hope it finishes. And you do all that just to end up with what we already have. We're using AWS for our infrastructure, and it just didn't make sense to make people go through all that heartache when we could just give them what we already have. So we are generating snapshots. So right now, we're still in the beta phase, so we release every 2 weeks, and our data is updated approximately every 2 weeks. So that's when we take our snapshot right now. And when we move into production at the end of the fiscal year and in the summer, we'll be taking nightly snapshots. And so we'll just continue to overwrite the RDS. So we're using RDS. I think a lot of the things on public data sets are S3 links, but we're actually just using our database snapshot. And the reason we do that is because we don't want people to have to go through all the work we've already gone through to process and normalize this data from flat files, and because of the hierarchical nature of the data. It just makes it easier to have a relational database snapshot available. And then we have all the source code available. So it's a Django project, so you can go in, install a Django project yourself, inspect the models, see what it's doing, see what the data loader does, how it gets in there. That's all public. So that's just like a screenshot of our GitHub page. Fed Spending Transparency is the name of our GitHub organization. And this is all in the USA Spending-API repo. And here are some links. Of course, our public datasets page, the beta site we have up there right now, and our GitHub site, so fedspendingtransparency.github.io, which will tell you more about the Data Act in general. If you are a federal spending data enthusiast like I am, you can go read more about it. And then, of course, our GitHub organization. And that's it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hand the baton.
Right back here. So you got your act together. Yeah, we're not quite there yet. I'm here to talk about a small project that we initiated with a small group called Data.World and AWS. It's a collaboration piece, but it's also setting the stage for where we're trying to go into the future. Census has, for a long time, had this problem where we have a lot of data, but we don't know how to package it in a way that's very consumable. It's very programmatically driven. So what I mean by that is if you are in Decennial, you generate your data through ACS, or Decennial's own dissemination tabulations. Or if you're in Econ, you disseminate it a different way. And we have a number of these different endpoints that create a number of these different differentiations between data sets. So you're an end user, you want to come to Census and use our data, you actually have to learn a lot about Census before you end up using the data. And that slows everyone down. And that's something we want to lower the bar on. All said and done, we have about 1.2 trillion estimates that we're trying to disseminate, but that doesn't include the metadata on top of that. And when we talk about interoperability, things get really hairy. And that's big. That's our biggest challenge to date. What we're finding is if we take an end user perspective, if we take a user-centric design perspective, we end up finding a lot of frustration. We see people going and bouncing between one data dissemination product to another, not sure what they're grabbing. They grab an estimate that might look right, but might actually not be appropriate for their exact question. And that leads to misinformation for the end user. They don't actually get the right answer that they're looking for, mostly because it's just too hard. It's also hard to take a flat file and then take a look at all the different coded values and then know which ones approximate others. Making things work together is a big part of it. And 80% of the data scientist time working with data, I think that might be a little generous. I think it could go a little higher in certain circumstances, and that's something that we're hoping to try to drive down. So the project that we took on was with Data.World. They had an NSF grant, Data Start NSF grant, that took a look at how they could derive a semantic approximation for a current tabulation. In this case, they took a look at PUMS data, which is actually untabulated data, kind of the holy grail of a social scientist research. It's a good place to start. You can get untabulated data at the PUMA geography, low-level geography, essentially like a neighborhood level estimate. And you get really fine level of resolution, which is really great because it also has a lot of breadth to it. You can take a look at just general demo data, but you can also see a lot of socioeconomic data. And that's really powerful when you start to apply it with other data sets as well. And what's great is that they took a semantic approach. So we have RDF triples up there, which is if anyone's familiar with that, you take a tab data and you create an RDF, it generally explodes in size. It's very big. And Data.World was looking for a partner to host these data and make it out of something that's very stable and that they could use quite regularly. And so Amazon stepped up to help us out with this. And what's great about RDF triples, again, is that you get the linkages. You get the properties between properties. And this allows folks to delve into the ACS data with far better resolution and granularity. But the problem is it still doesn't quite get you the full breadth. It's ACS, and that's great. And it's ACS PUMS, which is great. Very detailed, very useful. But we have a lot more data. And the real power comes from when you start to combine data sets, as we all know. And so when we build out this model, that gets us as a starting point. But what we want to do is take it a little bit further and build a platform that allows you to grab the data that you're looking for in a way that's understandable and consumable and accessible. And so that's where this idea about breaking down our silo issue comes into play. So how can we get data from ACS and Econ into the same umbrella and consumable to an end user who doesn't know the distinction between the two? How do we know what pop count you need for what tabulation summary file? These are very, very nuanced and census-specific questions that, to a lot of our users who are unfamiliar with census data, won't know the answer to it. You see data being federated out to other services, but they lack that intelligence because we need to embed it in that service that they're consuming. And so this is where this program called Census has evolved out of. It's an enterprise dissemination platform. I'm not going to go into the acronym because it's too long. But point is, we have a platform now that we're taking an enterprise-level approach to consolidate the dissemination services. So currently, we have a number of different places where you can get data. You can get it from the FTP, you can get it from the API, you can get it from American Fact Finder, and a number of these other more nuanced or tailored specific products. What we're hoping to do is kind of centralize that experience, at least in development and processing, so that we can have a more canonical data model that we can use and share more broadly to our end consumer, and do it in a way that's repeatable and standardized across all these different products. Oftentimes, we have these very specific products called, good example is My Congressional District. It's tailored to congressional district, and it uses ACS data to kind of give folks an idea about who is in their district. But the problem is it updates its cycle manually, not in the same way that, say, the API does or American Fact Finder does. These are disparate systems. So what we need to do is consolidate all of these systems into a single platform. And so what we're doing is we're building from the ground up. And we're taking an iterative design approach where we have a 2-week sprint cycle, but we're definitely not releasing every 2 weeks. That's impressive. We're doing around a 40-day cadence, and we're doing public releases around every 40 days. But we want to make sure that the data are right and correct, and so we're taking a very slow approach in that regard, and we're making sure that our testing is very thorough before we end up releasing. And we haven't open sourced our code yet, but it's coming, I promise. And what we're doing with this is we're going to try to exercise the platform with an interface that is comparable in capabilities to American Fact Finder, but then extends it. So everything we're doing in terms of a user interface is really just a way to dog food against the API itself, the API that's driving this front end. So the more capable we make this API, the better we can serve our customers with this front end, but more importantly, the better other people can extend our API and make their own platform that works better for their customer base. We're introducing a new idea for discoverability. Another big problem we notice is that folks don't know what they don't know, and so we need to provide a very user-friendly experience that allows them to click through and start to discover the breadth of census data. We oftentimes get interns coming in, and they really don't know that the census collects data outside of the decennial, which kills us. We do more than that, and we do really great stuff, and maybe it's just a communication question, or maybe it's just not discoverable. So the more we can make things more discoverable with semantic links through data.world efforts in collaboration with AWS, through these very user-friendly interfaces, the better. And so that's really a major effort that we're putting forward. And lastly, we're trying to consolidate our mapping experience, and this is a big one because one of our biggest problems is that people want data to have data, but they don't know what geography it associates with. And that can be quite challenging in a lot of cases. Working with geospatial data is also very challenging, very niche in a lot of cases. A developer who knows data may not know geo and vice versa. We want to try to simplify that experience and really consolidate that data exchange. So if you're interested, please check out data.census.gov. It's very early, and we are going to be having a release pretty soon, in the next 2 months, I hope. And so please stay in touch at data.census.gov. We'll be updating that regularly. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. So let's see. Is this thing on? Yeah, it's on, right? So we're going to open it up to questions in a little bit, but we've got a lot of time. I've got some questions prepared, but of course I'm going to go off script. Oh wait, hold on. Should I be using that? We should. Oh, okay. When we get to the audience, that's great. So anyway, so I'm going to go off script a little bit because you sort of answered my first question already. I'll just let you know. I actually told them what questions I was going to ask them.
That's just
that's
your mistake.
It poisons the well.
Yeah. That's right.
But having said that, here's one that I did not send them. So what I'm curious about is, what I was going to ask is that you're clearly going beyond just like, here's a portal, come download our data, or here's an API. You're thinking far beyond that, and I think you both explained why quite clearly in your presentation. So that was going to be my question, like, why did you do that? But you already said that. But what strikes me is that what you're doing now and you both talked about this, is you're getting your organizations to think about shipping data as a product on a more regular basis, and then even beyond that as sort of services. One experience I've had a lot working with governments that are trying to open up data is that one of the limitations they face is just funding and mandate. Like a lot of times the mandate's like, well, open up the data, I guess. Like what, you get to decide what that means. And so oftentimes very little goes beyond just making a download link or an API because that's never been asked. So I was wondering if both of you could comment a little bit on sort of what has been the organizational changes that you've seen made as you've done this work.
Yeah, well, I'll just say we were very lucky in that we have a law
This is the Data Act, right?
It tells people very, as specifically as I think a law should, right? Like you don't want it to get too into the weeds because it won't age very well. And it had a very strong oversight component. And I think that's why the Data Act has been successful is the bill was written very well. And I think there were certain things in there like, you must be able to add up business without double counting. And like certain clauses like that, which were interesting because they kind of force you to have a level of granularity in the data instead of just kind of releasing these aggregate numbers. And that really had to drive a lot of the policy that went into this, which was kind of a joint effort between OMB and Treasury. So I will say having a strong mandate and having like the IGs banging down these agencies' doors certainly helped us. And it was in the specificity. I think that's what's, you have some of these other open data efforts that have been around. Like, so Data.gov has been around in some form for, 7 years or something like that. And you have from the former administration, just these general memos on data availability and open data and like release 10 high value public data sets. What does that mean? And so like, I just think we're getting to the point where you're gonna have to be specific to measure how well you're doing and to be able to see the impact of some of this data.
Yeah, I would echo that. Specificity of the Data Act definitely helps. It's a very tight doc, and I think that provides a healthy impetus to start thinking about data in a little bit of a different manner. And also kind of disassociating the presentation of the data with the services that drive that presentation. I think that's something that we are focusing on heavily, and I think that has been the biggest change for leadership in that they're starting to recognize that we need to decouple these services to allow others to extend beyond our current capabilities. We can never, with funding and everything being so tight, we can only do so much. And so what we need to do is focus that energy into a place where we know that others can take it and run. And if we do our job right, we can enable those types of behaviors rather than making it kind of a pain and forcing other people to do the hard yards and struggle through it. We want to make the experience of collecting data as pleasant as possible. And a lot of the impetus for this came out of just not being able to get the quick answer that you're looking for. I mean, it's kind of simple, but what's the population of DC, right? Like that just one quick answer, that bar bet that you have with your buddy. Why is it so hard to get? What is that preventing? What are we prevented from doing to make that answer available to the general public? And expanding that idea that what Census does, as I talked about earlier, is really something that's critical. The 2020 is coming up, and something that we're really hoping for is increased awareness of what Census does. The years leading up to it is a big push to get people to understand why it's important to participate. And the more we can offer a value proposition to the public, I think the better we'll see in terms of when you get something in the mail or when you're asked to fill out something online. Maybe you're not so encumbered to fill it out. Maybe you're actually excited to do it.
Yeah, I think it's all about knowing what questions you want to answer, and I think like that's with the census data, it's real straightforward. Like I want to know the population of DC, or and I think that's when Congress with the Data Act they knew what questions they were trying to answer. Right. And so with some of these broader open data efforts, you're just like don't know what question and you have, then it's going to be difficult.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's a really good point. And figuring out those questions takes a ton of research that rarely gets done. I think that's fair to say. So the data sets you both talked about, the USA spending snapshot and then the PUMS data They've only been out for a little bit, but can you talk just a little about like what the reaction has been that you've seen, both internally and externally to your organization?
Very positive. I mean, I honestly don't have like metrics or anything on
Right.
it, so I don't know who's using it other than GAO, which had a lot of specific questions about what is in it. But yeah, very positive. I think when I tell people like, oh, well, if you need the whole dataset, just go here and link them to. I generated a really nice blog post about how to use it and how to restore the snapshot and everything. And I linked them to that, and they're like, oh. And I think their like brain kind of explodes because they're like not expecting that to happen.
Too easy. Yeah, I think very similar, very positive. I also do not have the metrics offhand, which I regret. But what we have noticed is that it's spurred a lot of internal conversation. Like, what is a graph database, and how could we potentially leverage it for our own purposes, right? And do we have the capacity to handle that kind of that kind of processing and storage? So it actually led to a lot of technical discussions, most internal to the building, which was good. We're always looking to kind of advance the stack that we're working with, and we're at a good point right now where we're starting to consider these types of questions, and so it actually facilitated a lot of internal questions, which is great. And we also are seeing uptake on data.world directly onto their experience, as well as we're hearing a lot of folks respond with this is great. What else?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a lot more.
More data.
More data, please. Yes.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the advantages of the Census brand, I mean, to your point, yeah, a lot of people don't understand all that the Census does, but, all those grad students and PhDs that love your data get really excited about this stuff. So, I saw some of that reaction on social media and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So, do you have, like, when you think about, having gone through this work to make the data available in this way, what is your wish list? I mean, first of all, the fact that GAO is using the snapshot is like super cool. I didn't expect that, but like, having been at Sunlight, assuming you were you back then again, and now you had the snapshot. Like, what would you be able to do now that you couldn't do before? You feel like?
Yeah. So I would spend a lot of more of my time doing actual analysis on the data, and less like trying to figure out how to get it loaded into a database. One of the projects actually that spurred some of this work, so when I was at Sunlight, we worked on this project with the Pew Charitable Trust called Subsidy Scope, and the whole goal of that was, what's the scope of federal subsidies in the economy? And it wasn't until we got pretty deep into the project where there's no way to measure this because the data is just not really available. And so we worked on this other site that kind of tried to measure the quality of the data on USA spending, and Congressman Issa got wind of it, and then there were some hearings, and then they had the first version of the Data Act, and then. Okay. And here I am years later, still working with it. But I think there's so much you can, especially like with census and spending data, I think to really be able to start to measure the impact of something, you have to know what you're spending on it.
Right.
And I think that just really wasn't available before. There was a few census products like FADS and certain other databases that they were kind of collecting, and some of those got shut down and defunded. So it really was difficult to get some of this data and tie it to impact. But I think now that the data is more timely and going to be available on a regular basis, and you have access to every expenditure account, you're going to be able to measure, I think, the impact in a way that you couldn't before. So that's what I'm excited. I hope somebody does.
It's really exciting. Zach, what do you have? You talked a little bit about RDF and sort of how linked data can make this data easier to work with. Have you talked to anybody about how making the PUMS data available in this way is going to allow them to do things that probably weren't possible before?
Yeah. So the associations between data, I think, are probably the most exciting piece of the release, and being able to quickly access it without having to walk through the data quite as much and have a piece of that discovery built within the data is incredibly powerful. And that's the thing that I'm really excited about in terms of that approach. It really does cut down on the amount of time it takes to process a PUMS file, and that cannot be understated. It's a non-trivial effort. And it is definitely over 90% of your time spent working with the data. And the minute you encumber our social scientists and the folks who are actually mapping out the effects or putting together a proposal for a grant, the minute you encumber that behavior, I think is a real disservice, and that's something that we need to lower the bar as aggressively as possible. So any approach where we are providing that associative data along with this semantic approach to this data store is I think, is something that I'm really excited about, and I'm excited to do more of that.
I'm like geeking out so much. I'm just like so happy to hear you say that.
I'm not sure where to go.
Well, no, I mean, it's just that like, you just don't hear that a lot. I think a lot of times, unfortunately, like with open data initiatives, like I said before, it's like, well, just open up the data. The data people will figure out what to do with it. And so that loop never gets closed. And so to actually think about what is the experience of that data scientist who's like, all right, this heading means, I have no idea what that means. So you could go back to the data dictionary again. Like all that time adds up, especially when you think about, say, thousands or tens of thousands of grad students out there. Yeah.
I mean, if you make it difficult, then you're going to introduce more errors. You're going to introduce more frustration. And when everyone talks about user experience and user interfaces as very visually driven, but why not that data scientist experience? What does that experience look like end to end? I go to the website and then what? Following that track, watching their intents, and trying to map that out very clearly so that by the end of it, we cut out and we drive efficiencies towards that experience and make it enjoyable. I mean, there's no reason why it shouldn't be. It's just not traditionally thought of as a typical user experience. But, that's where the gains are. Enabling those third parties, those people who want to know more about the information or can generate more insight out of that data, that's where the real gains are, I think. And that's where we want to encourage.
I think there's this negative feedback loop too, because agencies, they don't want to release open data because they don't know how to use it, so they'll draw the wrong conclusions from it. And then they release like a little bit, and then they draw the wrong conclusions from it. And then it's just this negative feedback loop. When I was at Sunlight, they opened up the House disbursement data as open data, and they're like, look at all Nancy Pelosi sending flowers to everyone. Women sending flowers, like, oh gosh. But the Speaker of the House is responsible for sending, funeral arrangements to any former member who passes. So like it all goes through her office or whatever. So, or the spending data, especially around Recovery Act, a lot of it goes to the state capitol, and then it gets dispersed throughout the rest of the state. And so everyone's like, look at all these like Democratic counties and like getting all this money because we just didn't have that next level of spending down.
Right.
So yeah, it just creates this negative feedback loop. So I think, you just kind of have to get in there and you have to explain and you have to provide information, and the solution to that is to be more open with the data and more iterative in your process and not to recede and clam up.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. Wild times. Okay, so I'm going to refuse to editorialize further on flooding the world with facts. So any other data sets that you're interested in opening up, or what's on your list? Anything?
Treasury has a lot of interesting data that I think is just not necessarily sensitive, just not public by virtue of the fact they haven't really thought about how to do it or had experience doing it. So I'm hoping that the Experience of Data Act, they start to release more of the information around like money moving between agencies, which is a big one, and invoicing and really getting down to like really granular details about how the money is spent. And I think that's where you're going to see a lot of impact of actually tracking improper payments, or when you hear about people who get paid for money that they shouldn't have, or on the do not pay list, or are getting Social Security checks in their debt or whatever. So I think they have a lot of really, really interesting data around that I think now that they have released the spending data successfully, we'll be able to kind of go through and see which ones are really high value and that they should release.
Cool. Yeah. Short answer is all of them. More.
Right.
No, so I think one thing that we're really taking a close look at is what are our products. And by products, I mean our tables, our tabulations, or any release. How can we construct those in a way that's a little bit more future-facing, rather than just thinking in print, right? Like, what is a table actually? Why are we generating tables? Or what is the most useful dissemination products that we should be considering? And so while we want to expand our set, I mean, our API has like 200 some odd endpoints, and that's the literal tip of the iceberg. But one thing we're hoping to do is build this platform that's flexible enough so that we can receive feedback direct from our data users and say like, well, the product is good, but what if it included X, Y, and Z, or it was structured in this way so that I could create my own views of this specific tabulation. I think we have a lot of opportunity there to kind of have a conversation with our data users a little bit more dynamically rather than saying, these are the products, these are what you're going to consume, and you're going to do your manipulations on those basic sets. So we're actually hoping to, while we want to expand our presence and our footprint, also drive a lot more of that feedback back into the Bureau and see what our data providers are willing to manipulate with.
Cool, thanks. So we have some, oh look, we already have a question now. He knew that I was done. So Joe has a microphone, he's going to bring it around. So the first question's in the back there, Joe, and then I think I saw another one, so.
You didn't send us these questions, I don't know.
Yeah, we have no idea what this person's going to
Those are
answer.
plans,
Very exciting.
Caitlin, Zach, thank you for sharing this with us and collecting the data. My question is, I guess, with regard to the Data Act itself and looking at the data as a continuum. Does the Data Act allow for, or is it, I guess, an extension that would have to be where, especially for census, the goal is really to share the data, right? That's the goal. So could the data be collected better in terms of the questions that I asked earlier, therefore, collecting the data and publishing the data gets better? And related to that, is it possible for your organizations to be the consumers of all the other government publishing organizations? For example, I know the Census came to my house and asked how much was the house worth, right? And then obviously the Fairfax County where I live in, across the border, publishes that, right? So they're all sort of interrelated and it's a continuum, right? Is the law not allowing that, or if these are all together, then that sort of solves or simplifies the problem, right?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that the law doesn't specifically allow it. I would just say it's like, like what we were saying earlier, a matter of priority with, limited resources. And, like it is all connected. We actually had a nonprofit come talk to us about, so there, a lot of formula grants are based on the ACS data. So this many people live here, so your Medicaid disbursements are X, Y, Z. And if the ACS data is not right, or it's not being maintained, then that affects the funding on a lot of levels for a lot of assistance programs. So it is all related, and that was kind of, they're able to track that data better and find out where there's flaws in the data by connecting those two data sets. So I definitely think it's all connected. It's just a matter of making it findable and usable and being able to prioritize it as much as possible.
Yeah, and on to your point about collection being a little bit more efficient, one thing I didn't touch on at all is a sister or a sibling program to SEDCAP, which is called SEDSci. I'm also not going to go into what that means. But what it essentially is doing is trying to modernize the way in which we collect data and provide an enterprise-level method for collection of all surveys. So the Decennial is obvious one, but then ACS and all the other programs as well. We want to make sure that we are standardizing and making an efficient and stable enterprise-wide platform for collection to be more, to increase the velocity of data through the system. And that's something that we're tracking towards for 2020, and hopefully you guys will be very pleased with the result of that.
Yeah, I mean, ideally the data passes through as few human hands as possible between being generated and being published, and we see that with grant recipients. They have to report the same data. You get an NSF grant, you've got to report it in like 10 different places or something like that, and it goes through all of these manual steps before it ends up getting to actual release. So I think the government overall just needs to be refining that kind of data pipeline and taking that philosophical approach of it's not acceptable anymore to do paper forms or just because it's a printable PDF that is not a digital form, and just looking for what I would say is pretty low-hanging fruit in terms of reducing the amount of time spent manually handling data.
Yeah, that is I couldn't agree more. Actually, I'm not even going to go further. That was perfectly said. Yeah.
So I think it sounded, okay, right up here. Oh, Joe, this one first, yeah, that's right.
Thank you. I was wondering, you all making discoverable or transparent, what kind of, what are the metrics of who is accessing your data? I would be particularly interested new startups or even existing companies, how they're leveraging off the data you're making available. In other words, not just for research purposes or whatever, but actually actionable usages. Is there a part of your, front-facing websites that one can go to see here's who's drawing on who's using your APIs, who's linked into your APIs, and that sort of thing? Thank you.
Yeah, so it's tricky. I mean, I would say we only know if we really interview them or talk to them directly, because we don't really want to force people to sign up for anything to be able to use the data. So that kind of inherently limits how we can track exactly who's using it. And just because we are the government, so if it was like I was GitHub, I could force people to fill out this form and tell me what's your industry and blah, 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 blah. But we don't do that because this is all public data and funded by the public. So that does put kind of like a damper. Mostly people we hear complaints from or who interview or participate in a usability interview or something like that. But we don't really, and I think even maybe republishing that information would be tricky just for a government site. Like, you can't put really like vendor information on the site because then it's kind of like you're implicitly endorsing them somehow. So I think it's tricky for government sites in a way that it's not for private. But it's kind of anecdotal for us right now.
Yeah, we try to we try to publish as much as we can to be as transparent as we can. In fact, we just recently published or assisted with a published website of API usage for commerce in general. And so one thing we do follow and we track for at least our data API, not our geospatial services or APIs, but our data API, we will be able to, we publish the, whether you're an EDU or a .gov or a .com, so we can give you a breakdown generally about who's consuming our data, and we won't go into like specifics about, whether it's all internal Census.gov requests or if it's external to the census, for example, but we are working towards a self-hosted experience where you would be able to see what data sets are performing the best or which ones are most popular, which ones are featured, new releases, and then the breakdowns of usage on that regard. But one thing we do know is that the real estate industry relies very heavily on census data. I don't know what they're doing with it, but yeah, they use it a lot, yeah. And the third party question, back to your, like the small startup thing, one thing we hear a lot about is I'm being throttled. Why? Because what we find is that our smaller startups will just go to our FTP and rip down as much as they can and repackage it into their own user interface and then disseminate it out to, say, like a local municipality. Basically, they just put a nice front end on what our data, and they organize it in their method and maybe append it with additional data. So we do know that there's a lot of that federation occurring, which is why one of our big efforts in terms of that API experience is to build that intelligence as to say, these are the data that you need for this specific question. And if we can do that, that means that their customers will get the right answer. And often the case in these circumstances is that third party will make a request to these sites, and they won't have the intelligence built in to say, like, this is the correct answer necessarily. We have a lot of that internal to the building, but if you don't know all the details and the nuances of the data, you tend to just get whatever answer you get, and the end user's happy because they got a number, but that might not be the best number that they could be using. So we're trying to build that intelligence through that pipe so we can enable those third parties to disseminate the number that we'd want them to disseminate.
This is our last question.
Zach,
Sorry.
I understand you have quite a bit of experience with hackathon, or organizing hackathons. So I'm interested in sharing some more experience and give us the detail and nuances about what process you went through and what kind of results you had. I sit on the board at University of Maryland, and we've organized some hackathons. I'd be interested in if you can pull an organization like yours and university together.
Yeah, so I think hackathons are a really great way to kind of spread the gospel and get really motivated folks into the same room to work on a problem set that's really tangible and germane to their lives. And I think that it's also a great teaching opportunity. Hey, these are the data sets that we have available. Did you know? No? Oh, well, great. And here it's such a powerful experience when you bring feds into a hackathon type experience, because they see so much excitement about the data usage, and they see creation and products being generated so quickly and at a cadence that we're not typically used to. I think that's a real eye-opener. And ultimately, I think the greatest value to a hackathon is internal to the building. You throw these things, and you get these great ideas, and you get great little products that could blossom into larger initiatives. But in terms of the building, like, wow, this API is so powerful because it can be used to extend and do X, Y, and Z. Maybe we need to break it down into a little bit more of that type of approach. So I've always seen these hackathons from a federal perspective as being really powerful to initiate change internal to the building. And the products that they generate and the people that go off and use the data more in the future is also just icing on the cake.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. Thanks for coming.